One of the major philosophical concerns for modernists was the effects of urbanization and industrialization on the mind of the individual. George Simmel observed that it was difficult to maintain our sense of self in the wake of a rapidly changing social and sensory landscape. He identifies the city's primary element as being a, quote, plurality of stimuli, which the city dweller would gradually come to suppress. Similarly, Walter Benjamin wrote that technological advances have fundamentally changed the way we create and interpret art. As the artist's techniques change, so too do their ideas and habits. And moreover, with the ability to reproduce on a mass scale, the relationship between everyday people and art has been irreversibly altered from what it was in pre-modern times. Both men equate the modern individual with a sense of dislocation and detachment, as though some vital part of our selfhood and creative potential has been severed by modernization. They reveal in their work a tendency to romanticize pre-modern society, referencing the greater cohesion of rural communities and the, quote, aura present in singular artworks, now dissolved by big city anonymity and mechanical reproduction. However, it could be argued that the sense of loss exemplified by Simmel and Benjamin is more emblematic of how the people in those societies felt rather than what they were genuinely experiencing. Admittedly, this is a small distinction, but perhaps important, and one that can be explored more objectively from the privileged gaze of the early 21st century. In his essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life, Simmel equates the city with modern living, and the country with pre-modern living. One of the key differences he cites is that the city dweller is perpetually bombarded with visual and oral stimulations, to the point where the world around them dissolves into nothing more than a, quote, urban buzz. As a process of adaptation, they grew detached from their surroundings and were forced to rely on their intellect and rationality, both traits championed by the modernist movement, to discern which fragments of city life are worth concentrating on while buffering out the rest. Simmel refers to this detachment as the blasé outlook, and equates it with a psychological barrier between an individual and the metropolis, imposed upon oneself in order to adapt to the, quote, swift and continuous shift of urban impressions. It has led to the creation of a largely apathetic populace, unique in their, quote, inability to react to new stimuli with appropriate levels of energy. In contrast, Simmel recalls that people in small towns are far more open and familiar, often recognizing and greeting one another on the street. There is a greater sense of community and sustained awareness among inhabitants and the natural environment. People in the country are more likely to know where their food comes from, or who provides their timber, or who tailors their shoes, or who delivers their mail. Everyday life functions more cohesively as a whole, centered around the notion of community, rather than as a collection of disparate encounters and anonymous faces. In Simmel's perception, the encounters of city life are stereotypically cold, reluctant, and fleeting, the inevitable result of intellectually reducing the number of possible human interactions. The experiences of family, work, education, dating, and leisure are compartmentalized and separated by the dazed, liminal spaces of the cityscape, perhaps best exemplified in the bustling yet estranged train ride. Because subjectivity has been taken away from the individual and incorporated into the city itself, their everyday life is reduced to tasks and mechanisms in service to the all-encompassing urban economy. Consequently, human interactions have become short and instrumental, lacking the emotional and personal involvement of small communities. The, quote, deepest problem of modern life is the fear that we have become so anonymous and interchangeable in the drone of urban stimuli that we seem not to exist at all. There is a measure of truth to Simmel's assertions. Anyone who has spent time in a large city has experienced that sense of metropolitan anonymity, of feeling alone and detached in a crowd of strangers. From the 19th century until today, small-town migrants have commented on the stark divide between country and city living. The blasé outlook is a necessity, without which one's mind would simply be overwhelmed by the noise and fury of the streets, the dismay of crime and homelessness, the euphoric possibilities of economic power, and the skyscrapers which puncture the labyrinth of vast urban experiences one is in danger of absorbing at any given time. Pre-modern societies can be equally isolating in their relationship to the individual. Simmel cites the presence of community facilitated by small-town familiarity. However, communities operate via a social contract, alternatively including those who abide and excluding or othering those who do not. There is a greater pressure to conform to the traditional values of the area, and people's lives and activities are under closer scrutiny from neighbors. The example of small-town exclusion often cited is homophobia, wherein a person's sexual orientation is perceived to challenge or go against the town's established cultural identity, and therefore must be suppressed or rejected. Conversely, the city dweller enjoys a greater level of personal freedom. The loosening of historical ties and the relative anonymity of the city serves to liberate the individual from their fixed cultural role and allows them to determine their own lifestyle, career, and friendships. This is why so many gay men living in the country migrate to the city, because it simply doesn't care who they are, so long as they can provide some service within its economic workings. Where critics of urbanization saw a social void, individuals saw a blank canvas, ready to be filled with new stories, new ideas, new styles of living and identifying oneself. The modern city represented the cultural and philosophical expressions of modernism, and artists present during this period were exhilarated by it, the rapidness of change and growth, the potential for new experiences, and the visuality of a transforming world. The streets became a stage for the, quote, enactment of modern life, and for writers and painters, the, quote, chaotic energy of the traffic and the maelstrom of the crowd was awe-inspiring. New technologies filled architects and designers with creative energies as they harnessed the power of science to map out a utopia of perfectly synchronized houses, streets, and traffic. And filmmakers were fascinated by the, quote, clockwork-like rhythm of daily life, as thousands of workers and office-goers entered and exited their workspaces at regular hours. However, in The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproductions, Walter Benjamin argues that because of modern technologies, namely the ability to reproduce artwork on a mass scale to identical specifications, original art pieces are losing their aura. Aura refers to the presence of a piece of art within space and time. That is, its singularity and authenticity as the creation of a particular culture. To remove it from that context, and to extract the idea and dimension from its original material form, is to remove the aura from that form. Reproduction strips the work to its religious utility, its exceptionality, and democratizes it for the masses. The art is liberated, transformed from an object of cult mysticism to a functional exhibition of craft. Great works create a historical understanding of what it means to be in a particular place and time. Just as the culture produces the art reflects and illuminates the culture, opening up the world to those who exist within it and for generations of people living long after the epoch has occurred. Thus, the shedding of aura through reproducibility also suggests the dissolution of the world around us, of historical presence and awareness. However, like Simmel's yearning for rural community, Benjamin's concept of aura has been criticized as fostering a, quote, nostalgic, purely negative sense of modernity as loss, a separation from human nature and the natural world. But the instinct to reproduce art is hardly a modern concept. Ever since the ancient Greek practices of woodcutting, stamping, and engraving, societies have been refining techniques of artistic replication. Modern techniques are vastly superior, but the principle remains the same. So, where does the apprehension stem from? In an attempt to illustrate the difference of modern technology, Benjamin uses the metaphor of comparing a painter to a cameraman, equating the former with magic and the latter with surgery, its polar opposite. Both men are addressing the same thing, a patient, but where the magician heals by touching them, the surgeon cuts into them with his tools. The magician recognizes the patient as a separate person and maintains the appropriate distance. Through the laying on of hands, the magician does somewhat objectify the patient, but this is remedied by the authority he conveys. The surgeon does exactly the reverse. He greatly reduces the distance between himself and patient by actually penetrating into the patient's body. He does not face the patient person to person, but only interacts with their material form. Thus his authority is beneath the magician's, existing only in the deftness of his hand movements. The magician does face the patient. He acknowledges their selfhood as a totality, mind, body, and soul. He maintains a natural distance from reality, while the cameraman deeply penetrates its web. The picture attained by the painter is a total one, a specific enclosure of reality which has been simulated and represented. The picture developed by the cameraman is made up of fragments. It is cut together from pieces of reality. It shifts through a plurality of perspectives and exists within the spaces of reality, rather than outside it. The cameraman, like the surgeon, is embedded, reducing the world to pieces of material which can be broken down, replicated, and reassembled somewhere else. Benjamin theorized that the modern application of art would only exist in the formulation of political and revolutionary demands. That is, that art would be created to give aura and cultural authenticity to state actors, such as the Nazi Party, which was rising to power during the publication of Benjamin's essay and made prominent reappropriation and replication of the Hindu swastika as a symbol of Nazi German domination. The danger, he saw, was that the modern individual was having their sense separated from the body's, quote, integrated experience. This alienation allows us to contemplate human destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the highest order. Modern, especially fascist, political powers build upon this anesthetization. Arguably, however, the rise of political parties throughout the 20th century was more closely induced by the collapse of pre-modern European power structures. Moreover, modern art, including painting, photography, and architecture, has become an important lens through which contemporary culture views the early 20th century, especially when contrasted with postmodern art in the latter half of the century. In a sense, the reproduction of art becomes an aura unto itself, the aura of modernism.